So I thought actually Lynn asked a really good question last week that kind of, I think, was sitting in the back of my mind this whole week as I prepped. And that question was like, okay, Christ came, so why do you keep talking about waiting and watching? What exactly are you waiting for in Advent, right? And so that one was kind of hanging out in the back of my mind. Also just the question of, what should this waiting and watching for Christ to come again actually translate into our lives? Why is waiting and watching matter in any way, shape, or form? So keep those in the back of your mind as well, and we'll see if we can stumble towards an answer a little bit this week, because we're going to do another passage out of the Old Testament that is going to do kind of the same thing. It's going to be talking about one specific thing, this day when the exile ends and they're celebrated. But that's also kind of a hint, a foreshadowing of a different homecoming. And I think there's a lot of this in Christ's life as well. The things he does are foreshadowings of a fullness that we're still waiting on, which is the hint, I guess, on some of that what we are waiting for, fullness of homecoming. The book of Zephaniah in the Old Testament, if you've never read it, is good, fiery Old Testament prophetic stuff. It's a really harsh book. It uses actually a lot of almost crude language. It talks about people's guts being spilled in the streets and stuff. It's a very graphic, harsh book. And as far as we can tell, Zephaniah himself was a contemporary of Isaiah. He was likely a student of his, or like an apprentice of Isaiah, so his book isn't as famous. But he wrote in a time when basically the leadership of his people were nihilistic, for lack of a better word. They just believed they could do whatever they wanted. They didn't think God was going to be there. God cared, and he echoes their words and throws it back in their faces a bunch, saying like, "Wow, God's not here. What do I care? Oh, God's not here. We can do whatever we want, right?" And so there's a lot of imagery about who is among us, who is here, because the people who are among us, the leaders that are among us, are lions, or they are people who are eating the people they're supposed to be taking care of, is one of his many graphic images he uses of this group of people. But the book itself ends on one of my favorite passages in the entire Bible. It ends with this really beautiful, beautiful note that we'll look at today. And I think it's important to recognize kind of the context and how harsh this book is, to recognize kind of the impact that this passage that we may or may not be familiar with can have. I was reminded of one of my favorite pieces of avant-garde jazz, because apparently that's what everyone listens to. There's this piece of kind of protest music that came out in the 60s, kind of post-World War II, called Machine Gun. And what it is it's this like squawky, you guys ever heard this squawky jazz where they, instead of making it sound real pretty, it's like, so it's this stuff. And then the drummer's doing this machine gun rhythm, like and so it's about 20 minutes long, and for the first about 18 minutes of it, it's just squawking and these noises. It's just this chaotic mess. And then at the very end, these four saxophones that have been making this chaotic, loud mess, all on the exact same time, they all walk in and play like a classic kind of jazz swing line. It's just a good little tune. It's really beautiful. But when you've been listening to 18 minutes of this horrible, squawking, beat-up music, like you've never heard something like this moment of what in any other song would be this kind of just normal, fun jazz moment. But it locks in and it ends on this note of like, okay, there may be some hope. There may be some meaning. And it's very dramatic. Most people, I wouldn't necessarily recommend sitting through this thing to hear that moment. But it's really striking when tone comes back after a long time. And I think that's largely what's going on in Zephaniah. It has been squawking, it has been harsh, it has been ugly, and then we get this. Shout for joy, daughter of Zion. Israel, shout aloud. Rejoice, exult with all your heart, daughter of Jerusalem. Yahweh has repealed your sentence. He has driven your enemies away. Yahweh, the King of Israel, is in your midst. You have no more evil to fear. When that day comes, word will come to Jerusalem, Zion, have no fear. Don't let your hands fall limp. Yahweh your God is in your midst, a victorious warrior. He will exult with joy over you. He will renew you by his love. He will dance with shouts of joy for you as on a day of festival. I have taken away your misfortune. No longer need you bear the disgrace of it. I am taking action here and now against your oppressors. When that time comes, I will rescue the lame. I will gather the strays. I will win them praise and renown when I restore their fortunes. And when that time comes, I will be your guide. And when that time comes, I will gather you in. I will give you praise and renown among all the peoples of the earth when I restore your fortunes under your own eyes, says Yahweh. So the key theme that Zephaniah plays with in his book is presence. Who is among you? Who is present? And he kind of goes about the people you have among you right now are not doing their job. They are part of the problem up until this point. But everything is going to change when we realize again that God is in our presence. God is among us. And we have to remember kind of contextually in the worldview at the time, that was a really radical claim. It still was. That was the big claim that set God's people in Israel apart from everyone else in the world at that point. You know, the gods were associated with the land. So when you moved across country, you got to figure out who the new God is, right? The gods are also apart and distant. They're not among us. They're not interested in our daily lives. That's why we go up on mountaintops. They live in the high places. They're other. They're apart from our daily lives, right? And I think that's one of the big things that God is trying to teach them by setting up a tent, a tabernacle, right? Again, the exact same language that the New Testament uses for Jesus. God came and tabernacled among us, set up his tent among us. So rather than all the other gods, you have to go through these elaborate rituals and professional priests and all these things, climb up on a mountaintop to convince them to leave you alone for another year. There's a God living at the center of camp right among the other people. That's what the temple is, again, supposed to be. God's presence is right here among you. I ran into kind of the complaint of Balaam this week when he was supposed to curse the people. And he goes, I can't curse these people. Their God is right there. He's in them. He's in there among them. Of course you can't beat them, right? This was a really gutsy claim in the ancient world. It was totally against how everyone viewed God. God is here, he's near, and he's among you. And Zephaniah's complaint is kind of a reminder, a call back to that radical claim. God's right here. Why on earth are you going elsewhere for protection? Why are you climbing the hills trying to figure out who's the latest, most fashionable God? Why are you letting the leaders tell you what's important or allying with the bad guys because they're more powerful, right? God is among you. God is right here. God has promised. So why are you trusting all those other things? There's certainly no critique of us nowadays in that either, right? God is right here. God is the one that will provide and protect. So why is it exactly that we trust fill in the blank? Our bank accounts, our skills, our hard work, our networks of relationships. There's a lot of things we could fill in there. God is right here. He's among you. Why are we filling in those other things? I think there's also a critique of this idea that God is distant and far away, that God is aloof or doesn't care, that I got my real life to do, and oh yeah, I should probably throw in a few prayers every now and then, or go to church, or throw a little money at charity, right? I got to do some of that stuff to keep him off my back, because at the end of the day, I got my life to live, and you know, God's an important part, but he's out there, he's up there. He's distant. It's still a default we have with God. God is far away. God is unconcerned with the details of our lives. Those are too petty for God. I should be beyond this spiritually at this point. I shouldn't be this worried and this afraid. And yet we hear this word again and again in this passage. You don't have any more evil to fear at the end of 15. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Comes up a couple of times. I've heard some people say that could be the theme of Advent overall, right? The number of times the angels say that. Don't be afraid. I'm here. I'm among you. I am close and concerned with those things, not far away. In this passage, we see again a really active God, right? God is not sitting back saying, clean yourself up, go through the right rituals, and then I'll come and be concerned, right? There's tons and tons of action words in here. When I restore, when I am near, when I do this action. God is close, God is doing things, God is active. Or do we think God is far away and we need a backup plan? Because what if God doesn't come through? This passage contains one of the most beautiful phrases in the Old Testament about what God says. It's this verse, where is it? In like 17, it says, He will exalt with joy over you, renew you by His love. He will dance with shouts of joy. The words in there are ones that are easy to pass over. They are words that are based on singing over someone in delight and love. In the entire Old Testament, these words are all over the place in the Psalms. We are supposed to delight and shout in joy, sing songs of praise to God. And here, God is singing praises to us. He is singing over us in love. It's the exact same language that David used left and right. Praise God for His goodness to us. And there is something, almost embarrassing, almost scandalizing, when you recognize what we've done to the world, the mistakes we make, right? Of hearing that God is rejoicing and praising us, not Him, and that's why He's doing these things. And so I think I was reminded a little bit of this just kind of prophetic call that Advent has, that we do need to look at the harsh reality that Zephaniah was dealing with, right? Leaders who were eating their people. A bunch of people who were looking anywhere and everywhere but for the God that was among them. I think we need to recognize that there is a veneer that things are okay a lot in this world when they're not. And a lot of the people in Zephaniah's day kind of turned to hopelessness in that, well, it's not going to get better. It can't be made better. That same attitude is one that Jesus fought a lot as well, right? This hopelessness, this cannot be fixed, this cannot be better. And there's a rejection of that in Advent. The words, again, so many times are, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. 17 tells us not just that God is in our midst and that He's exulting with joy, that He's praising us. He loves us so much. It also says that He is going to renew, make new, or quiet is another possible translation. I have no idea how those words are moved. But maybe it's a sense of quietness, this deep sense that things are okay because God is bringing life out of it. I think messages like this would have meant something very different to people who had just lost their home or were about to, and that was a very real possibility. Although interestingly, as far as we can tell, Zephaniah was likely one of the major influences on King Josiah. He probably heard this message and actually did something about it, right? It's easy to hear this stuff and not realize real world change can come from a message of hope like this. It didn't get to the grassroots level in a lot of ways. A lot of people did not embrace this the way the king did. But that one man made a lot of difference. He's considered one of the greats because he took a message like this and he did something with it. He did not take his circumstances and believe that they were ultimately true. He believed when God said, I can renew, I can restore. And most of the people who would actually embrace this message are several generations later, right? It got bad. But they did get to be gathered again by God. They did get to come home. But that wasn't the ultimate promise either. The ultimate promise is a time when it won't degrade again. When things won't go bad. When the darkness, when the leaders don't eat their people. We're still waiting for that ultimate promise, and that's sprinkled throughout the Bible. That was what Jesus talked about a lot as well. It's here. It's growing, God's presence again. Zephaniah likely would have been shocked at how literally that came about. But the idea of these beautiful visions of hope, of finally being gathered, of finally getting to come home, of finally experiencing in full God laughing, and singing, and rejoicing, and renewing, and quieting. That's coming. That's a promise that we can have in hope despite the circumstances. We don't trust the story being told around us. But just like I think Zephaniah inspired King Josiah, just like the book of Revelation is mixed with both really hard stuff and an ultimate word of hope and victory that God wins in the end of this story. The reason we are given those stories, the reason we are given messages like this, is because we should be looking around at the status quo and saying, yeah, that doesn't really jive with what I see, with what those promises are, with the kind of God that is working in the world, right? We're given these messages of hope because we're expected to live them out right now. Because if hope is just something on the horizon, who cares? It's coming anyway, right? God shares his dreams with us, these hopes, both in the coming of Advent the first time and in the coming of home, this gathering. Because God's presence is among us. That's the promise. That's still true. It looks different. God came in the flesh and touched people, but he said, look, I'm limited right now. I can only touch so many people. I can only talk to so many people in the eye. And so my Spirit is coming. And I'm sending all of you. Because you are my presence. Can you hear this song? Can you hear this dream of hope of what's coming when things are full? Can you try and figure out ways to live this? Because it can be here. Though the world won't know it or appreciate it. I'm here. I'm close. I'm among you. You don't need to be afraid. I will be enough.